talking about quote unquote wasting time, Marva Dawn wrote a book on worship called A Royal Waste of Time, which I think is really, really brilliant. We're talking about wasting time relative to what a cult of efficiency tells you. And we're always talking about quote unquote wasting time with others. The more we imagine our timekeeping tethered to friendship tending, the more we will sort of learn how to inhabit time faithfully.
Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. Today I'm talking with Jamie Smith about spiritual timekeeping. You may know Jamie Smith. He goes by James K.A. Smith on his many, many books, but the book that he's just written is all about time, and so it seemed fitting to have this conversation at the end of the calendar year and near the beginning of the liturgical year. And if you aren't familiar with the idea of a liturgical year, it's something we'll talk about on the podcast. But the reason I wanted to have this conversation now is for any of you who are, like me, often feeling that there isn't enough time, and you wish you could just get a better hold on time. This episode, as we enter into a new year, is a chance to also enter into a way of greater freedom with time. We talk about history and contingency and limitations and Black Lives Matter and hope and disability and slowness and love and so many other good things. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Well, I am sitting here today with Professor James K.A. Smith, also known as Jamie, and the author of a number of books that I have read and valued and really appreciated. Although today we are just here to talk about the most recent book that I have read and appreciated, and that one is called How to Inhabit Time, Understanding the Past, Facing the Future, Living Faithfully Now. So Jamie, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to see you again. Good to chat. Thank you.
Well, I was so intrigued by your book because you're pretty clear really quickly in the opening pages that yes, this is a book about time, but it is not a book about time management. And in fact, it's a book about what you call spiritual timekeeping. And I would really love to have just to jump in with a definition or an explanation of spiritual timekeeping, and also how is that different from time management?
Yeah.
Like why do we need to really almost divorce those concepts from one another so quickly in this book?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, I think. I think time management assumes a way of relating to time that I want to challenge. Mm-hmm. So that's why I want to do something else. And I think time management is, it sort of treats time primarily as a commodity. Mm-hmm. And also treats it as if time is just something that is kind of out there for me to control and master.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm talking about when I talk about spiritual timekeeping is really starting to recognize the histories that live within us and becoming aware of the sort of body clock, if you will, in an incarnate sense, of the fact that we are these creatures who are shaped by time, immersed in time, that it's precisely why time is never something that you could just manage. Mm-hmm. Because it's not something out there over which you could be master. Instead, time is like the water we swim in as creatures. Mm. And so we need to learn how to swim, not how to control. And I think that means accepting a lot of things about our creaturehood, really.
And I'm struck by a quotation early on in the book. You wrote, "We don't need coaches who will help us manage our time. We need prophets who make us face our histories." And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that it's that sense of facing our history as a really essential aspect of swimming in time.
Yeah. And this is, and you will have seen in the book, I don't know if I'm a little greedy in what I try to do in the book, but I think all of this holds true, both on a personal and individual level and on a collective and communal level. So
Mm-hmm.
all the same dynamics, sort of like I can grapple with these things for myself, but I think we,
Yeah.
this us, whatever that us might be, needs to grapple with these things. So in my case, a real catalyst for thinking about these matters was my own experience in therapy and counseling,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and what I discovered, which turned out to be a really intense and significant spiritual journey.
Mm.
And I would say the thing that I maybe learned the most significantly was that if I was going to be whole and healed, I needed to reckon with my past. I needed to
Mm-hmm.
sort of face and grapple with and reckon with the history that I had undergone as a person, as a
Yeah.
son, as an individual, and so that sense of the prophetic moment, I think, is about this reckoning with our past, which
Mm-hmm.
means that sometimes we need people to show it to us because we happily turn a blind eye to the parts that we don't want to face.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that was going on when I was really starting to work on this book was the murder of George Floyd by police,
Yeah.
and that was such a catalyst again. We said, this always has to keep happening over and over and over again in the United States, but it was a catalyst again for a kind of collective, even national reckoning again with a past that I think we all too happily would bury in the basement and ignore, and it was sort of prophetic voices that were calling us to face that past. So um, that's the sense of, and it's interesting. I do think that that's sort of a biblical notion of the prophetic as well. The right that
Mm-hmm.
often what the prophets do is sort of call God's people to confront what they would rather not. And
Mm-hmm.
often that's about, where they have gone and how they have gone astray. But it can also be how they've been harmed and delivered, and recalling that too. I don't know. I feel like I don't want to ramble too long about that, but does that help?
No, it totally helps. And there are a couple threads I want to pull on a little bit because I agree with you that there, for me, and maybe this is because we live in such an individualistic society, understanding healing on a personal level, which kind of inevitably involves the past and reckoning with the hardest things, things that I had wanted to cover for so long because it felt like, why would I ever go back there? It hurt. I don't want to go back there. And yet, going back to that pain and really essentially bringing it into the light of God's healing is the only way for that pain to not just continue to be carried within not even just my spirit but my body. And you write about this as well, how much we literally carry these things, and that's been really helpful for me in thinking about our collective pain as a nation that is so embedded in our history, especially as it pertains to both Indigenous peoples and the African American, beginning obviously with enslavement and then continuing to this day. And I think that's similar, just as I say, well, I don't want to look at what hurt when I was in high school because who would relive something if you don't have to? And yet needing to do that. I think that's really similar to what we need to do on a conscious collective level, especially as white people. Although it's true, I think, for all of us in the sense that whether you have been on the side of kind of perpetrating harm or receiving harm, everyone's been harmed in that process. There's a
Yeah.
pain that needs to be reckoned with. And yet I think one of the reason that being prophetic about it is important is essentially the hope of redemption, the hope of healing, the idea that facing our history is actually a hopeful, forward looking possibility, realm of possibility. And I think you speak to that in your book as well, just that sense of this is not for the sake of feeling bad about what happened in the past, but actually for the sake of the healing or redemptive work that might be able to happen.
I'm so glad you sense that, because that's exactly right. The whole point of the reckoning is to be able to live forward in hope.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that is part of where a kind of Christian or redemptive imagination has a gift to offer our wider culture, because I think there are versions of looking to the past that basically think that we are only and entirely victims of what has come before, whereas
Mm.
there has to be a possibility of a self transcendence
Hmm.
of that history. And I would say that's the mystery and gift of the possibility of grace. I mean,
Mm.
it's interesting. I do think reckoning with our past is confronting, the shadows and the things that we've buried, but it is also turning back and to receive the gifts that have been handed down to us as possibilities, even if
Hmm.
they have been latent or, we haven't picked them up. And in that respect, I mean, I really do
Mm.
think that, say, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is an exemplar of
Yeah.
this dynamic that you're talking about, which is on the one hand, you know, prophetically needs the United States to confront its history, but it's not actually to just sort of wallow in guilt or even sort of like get a perverse pleasure out of how guilty we feel, which is a
Yeah.
strange dynamic today.
Yep.
The whole point is to say there's also possibilities here. There have been checks that have been signed that we haven't been able to cash yet.
Mm.
And so I think that's precisely why you can then imagine a different future. And I think that's true on a personal level too. Like someone who's suffering from really darkened depression,
Mm.
which I can recall.
Yeah.
One of the things that's so paralyzing about that is it's so almost impossible to imagine that the world could ever be otherwise when you're in the
Mm.
midst of it.
Yeah.
Whereas the gift of therapy, counseling, this kind of reckoning is that it also cracks open the
Mm.
present so that you can start to imagine a different future.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that really speaks to the nature of hope, right? That there is some sense of being able to tether something in the present to a future promise. And even, I'm thinking of light in the darkness, where it's not everything is bright light right now. Actually, everything is dark right now, but there is a light in the darkness. And yeah, there's something to that. I'd love, actually, I want to skip ahead in my own notes here, based on what you just said, because something I found so compelling was when you were writing about nostalgia as a false view of history and progress as a false understanding of the future. So maybe we can start there with just both of those, kind of the problems with nostalgia and the idea of progress, but then also what's a proper, like, what's a corrective in terms of how we think about the past and the future.
Yeah, so one, let's say, feature of this kind of spiritual timekeeping is an awareness that to be human is to inevitably be the kind of creature who remembers and
Mm.
is indebted to a past, and also a creature who lives leaning forward and is in some way oriented to a future, right? So we're always stretched between these. But how we remember and how we live forwards is kind of what's at issue. And
Yeah.
nostalgia, I think nostalgia is such a powerful narcotic in our culture right now.
Mm.
Um, and the problem with nostalgia is not that it remembers. Remembering is not that we're enjoined to remember. I think it's crucial to remember.
Yeah.
The problem with nostalgia is what it very actively forgets.
Mm.
Nostalgia is always this highly edited version of the
Hmm.
past. It's this kind of romanticization of some history, and usually someone's history, and some version of a history where some benefited and others didn't.
Yeah.
Or even in my personal life, I can engage in a kind of spiritual nostalgia where it's like, well, I remember, when I was 20 and going to college worship services and I was so close to God.
Yeah.
But you're also forgetting like how immature and foolish you were. So you can again, you can romanticize the past.
Yep.
I think that's a problem with nostalgia. I think um, a kind of sort of um, overconfident progressivism
Yeah.
is a way of imagining a future which is also kind of disordered, because what happens now is you project a future entirely confident in your own ingenuity and what you think you see right now. And I'm a devotee of St. Augustine. I think anytime we get overconfident in ourselves is usually a recipe for not just disappointment, but actually it's going to be dangerous for somebody, because we think we see the way it's supposed to go, and now we're going to make it happen. I think we should all get a little bit nervous about that. So the contrast then between let's say, what does healthy remembering look like? Healthy remembering is this reckoning we were talking about. It's this sort of recalling and realizing the way that the I am today is the product of a story and a history that I have undergone, and to realize that God has been with me in all of that, even if God has to pick up the fragments in order to make a mosaic in the future. But in the same way, I think hope, as you mentioned, I think hope is so different from optimism. Hope is so different from just confidence in progress, because hope is an expectation of the future that is not indexed to our ingenuity or our purity or our moral superiority. It's completely dependent upon a God who can raise the dead. You've probably heard the Leslie Newbegin line, I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And I think that gets at something that's distinct about hope.
Yeah.
And I do think it's difficult to be hopeful without some sense of a transcendence that's gifting us something. That's probably a different conversation, but I do think one of the reasons that our culture struggles with despair, and I understand it, like I get it, but I think we are more prone to fall into despair when when we get burned out on our misplaced confidence in progress, but also when we don't really have a sense that there's anyone outside of us to whom we could entrust ourselves. And I think this is another way in which if Christians wanted to be gifts to their neighbors, we could try to live out how and why it looks different to live hopefully, which is a lot harder than it sounds, by the way.
Yeah, I read. I think this was, I read an interview in Christianity Today with Mike Cosper and Bono recently, and I don't remember which one of them said it. I think it was Mike Cosper who said to Bono that he realized that many of their U2's songs, even though they are laments, because they are laments, they are messages of hope, because they are not despair. They're not saying, here's how it is and it will never change. They are saying, here's how it is and it should not be that way. And so we are crying out against it because we know that there is something, that sense of kind of tethering our hope to a promised future that's different. And that was a really helpful distinction for me, to recognize lament as an aspect of hope. And I think, again, that's so different than optimism. That's so different than toxic positivity. We just have to have a good attitude or a good mindset. Naming what is wrong right now, recognizing what has led to that in our past, and yet instead of that making us be people of cynicism, despair, or rage, it can instead actually be a part of turning us into hopeful people towards the future. That to me seems actually like this, I don't know, great redemptive arc that is kind of miraculous, I guess.
By the way, I have never heard the phrase toxic positivity before, but oh my gosh, does that make sense of so many things that I loathe? It's absolutely true, and I think I'm in the middle of Bono's memoir Surrender right now, and it's absolutely marvelous, especially for like a white dude of a certain age,
even a white girl of a certain age.
Yes,
so
yeah,
I just read it.
And I think that's exactly right. This sense of it is lament is lament because it's haunted by hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also why lament is not just protest. It is protest.
Right.
It's a confrontation, and it's a confrontation with God that's honest and unveneered. But it is, you're coming to God, which is what makes it a posture of trust and faith and hope
Yep.
and love.
Yeah. Well, one other thing I want to just kind of pick up from something you've already said and that you write about in the book as well is this idea of the fragments and pieces ultimately coming together in a way that is a mark of God's faithfulness and essentially of God being the Lord of time, right? Like that we are not, like we cannot be masters of time. And I do think idolatry of time is one of the things that can come alongside time management. And I am very much convicted regularly of my own participation in that. And I have to remind myself, God is the Lord of time, and I am not. And so when I do that, I think one of the ways in which the biblical story, and particularly the story of Jesus, helps me is that sense of these scars that were your death. I mean, the symbols of your death become the symbols you demonstrate. I mean, you say to your disciples, like, look at this. This is what identifies me as the risen Lord is my scars. And so that sense of that brutal past being swept up somehow, and you get here by the the very end of the book, especially into a story that not only, I don't know if makes sense is the right word for it, but that can be beautiful and particular and again hopeful and true. um yeah, I just that seems like an important part of all of
No,
this.
absolutely. And by the way, I think what you say about the particularity of all this is really, really important. In other words, um, the intimacy and specificity of God's being with us, uh, to gather up each of our particular wounds,
Yeah.
to gather up, um, and to reckon with, by grace, the traumas that we've endured, uh, and so that grace and redemption are not just these reset buttons, so that
Hmm.
you sort of erase what's gone before, and now I'm a new creation because I'm a blank slate,
Yeah.
or I'm a new character in the video game. That's not how God's redemption works, and Christ exemplifies that. God's redemption is in. I think this is more miraculous.
Right.
It's not that we all start now as these generic Christians who have this new life. It's no, it's in fact me with all my particular hurts and harms and histories and gifts and talents, and the history that I have lived through is part of what God gathers up now and sort of re-releases. It's like a
Hmm.
digitally remastered version of a U2 album, right? So there's and so it comes with all of that specificity about it, and God is going to use what I have undergone as almost like a lever, or it will be part of my mission in the
Right.
world because I have lived this particular history. This is why I think, as you know, I emphasize discernment a lot
Hmm.
as sort of,
Hmm.
the pivot point between reckoning with our past and hoping for a different future is discerning, okay, what am I called to now? And listening for the Spirit's guidance in that regard is also being attuned to the particularities of my story, and to say, this is what God has sort of brought me to, and this is what maybe only I could do in the world because only I have lived this history. I find it
Hmm.
intimate and restorative in ways that other versions of redemption sort of, I think, fall flat.
Yeah, because I mean, again, back to that particularity, and I think we don't want to go in the direction of God doing the wounding, but in the direction of God being able to always overcome, like to hold all of that. And I think this actually like leads me to some questions I have around the idea of regret. Because one of the things you write about is contingency and just that sense of knowing. I think you get to a certain point, again, we're kind of admitting our middle-aged status here.
Yes.
I'm a little younger than you, but both of us have gotten to a point in our life when we can look back and say, "Oh, I didn't even know I was closing the doors I was closing. I didn't even know I was making the choices I was making. But now here I am." And like there are possibilities that honestly 10 or 20 years ago were still open to me and they aren't anymore. And I certainly found myself in this period, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, in the last 3 to 5 years, where I felt a sense of deep regret over some of the choices that I had made. And I was, again, really convicted and comforted too, I think, by this idea that that God is the Lord of time, and that means the past, the present, and the future. And so it, even if I did make, I don't know, bad choices along the way, that doesn't mean that God was not present and cannot redeem that. And some of those choices were necessary ones, even if they narrowed my life, right? And so it feels less filled with endless possibilities. There still are particular possibilities ahead for me. And so I just thought I'd ask you to talk about the idea of contingency, but maybe also where regret and faithfulness fit into that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I do think this is a feature of accepting our mortality
Mm-hmm.
and accepting our creaturehood, which I
Yeah.
just think middle age and later is sort of the season of your life that you get to a place where you can accept that. In a way, I don't want somebody in their 20s to
Yes.
imagine all the possibilities that have been shut down. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Be ambitious and dream, and there are so many doors. That's exactly what somebody in that season of a life should be doing. But I think it's worth saying too that it's okay if we still sort of I expect to actually, in an ongoing way, still have sort of twangs of if only. Do you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's just confession, right? That's just confession to say that might also be a natural part of being like in my experience. What I find is, I'm in my 50s now, and I still feel like the world is. I'm still learning so much about the world, and learning about like whole new kind of corners of the world, and then all of a sudden you're 52 and you learn about this whole other sort of sphere of culture or something like that, and you're like, I'm kind of mad nobody told me about this when I was
Yes.
18. Like if I had known this was,
Yes.
I think I would have done some things different. And
Mm-hmm.
then inevitably Deanna, my wife, will be like, but but
Yeah.
here's your story,
Right. Right.
and here are all the gifts that have been handed down to
Mm-hmm.
you, and the question now is, what are you going to how are you going to pick those up gratefully in such a way that you accept limitation? I mean, I
Yeah.
really do think to remember the distinction between creature and creator
Yeah.
is to sort of accept our finitude, to accept our mortality, to live with our limitations, and to then realize still how much is possible within those limitations, right? It
Yep.
doesn't mean my future just looks like my past. It just means, okay, it can be liberating to know this is my repertoire. This is my corner of the field to till. And
Right.
now let's dig deep. Let's
Yep.
go long, and to be faithful. A long obedience in one direction, I think,
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
Eugene Peterson quoting Nietzsche. I think that can be liberating because then I'm not constantly. I don't have sort of FOMO, vocational FOMO about
Right.
like, oh, if I could have done this, if I could have done this. That's also exhausting and paralyzing.
Right.
And so I think there's gifts to be found in the acceptance.
Do you know the novel The Midnight Library?
I don't.
So I mean, you might have fun with it. You could read it in like two
Yeah.
days. My son weirdly was assigned to read it in eighth grade, as kind of a bonus reading thing, and he gave it to me. And it's a woman in her, I think she's actually in her mid 30s, who tries to take her life, and swallows a lot of pills. And it's then she kind of enters into this it's kind, I mean, it's not really sci-fi. It's like, anyway, she ends up in this library where she's in a liminal space between death and life, and she gets the opportunity to live all the lives that she wishes she had lived. And so and if she finds one that she actually would like to stay in, she gets to. So it's kind of a metaverse thing happening, you know.
Interesting.
But it's really a meditation, I think, on these themes of regret and of, wait, what would it mean to actually receive the life that I have been given, the mistakes that I have made? And there's no God in this book, but I don't know. I found it so compelling from in thinking through from just a very, fictionalized
Yeah.
place all of these types of questions and really saying, what if I am supposed to be living the life I'm living? And all of the messiness of it and the giftedness of it is actually making me even today who I am. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great. No, that is a great setup for exactly what we're talking about.
yeah.
And I know in when I am sort of in my spiritually healthiest place, which is not always, I know that this is bound up with gratitude. So it's mostly
Hmm.
and I don't know what's the chicken and what's the egg in this regard. I
Yeah.
don't know if cultivating gratitude is what helps me to come to these places of acceptance and focus, or
Mm,
if it's working on the acceptance and focus, and then when I have that posture, I realize, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is my life.
right.
I think content.
Well, and all right, two directions I want to go. One is to talk about the present moment because we've talked a lot about like what we need to do to understand the past and the future. And then there is this question of what it means to live faithfully in the present. And I want to link that to some of the ways that I have learned a lot and grown a lot in these areas is by having a daughter with Down syndrome. So and it's not to say that, I mean, Penny absolutely thinks about the future and remembers the past. But she also has a different relationship to time than I do. There's an abstraction to the future and the past that is truly hard for her intellectually to understand. And I do think that actually enables her to live more faithfully in the present than I do a lot of the time. So that's something that she offers to me and invites me into. And having her in my life has helped me just think a little more differently about people who have dementia, for example, and who are much more fully in the present than I am. And the ways that can obviously be a problem in and of itself to only live in the present, but it also how it can be a gift. So I'm curious, like, just to hear some of your thoughts on what it means to live faithfully in the present in time before God.
I feel like I should be listening to you here, because I mean I think that strikes me as really a powerful way. Uh, in a sense, you've experienced a discipline of a
Mm,
way of attending to time
mm-hmm.
that has maybe because I think mostly what living faithfully in the present looks like, maybe not mostly, significantly, is a mode of learning what to let go of.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost like there's a sense in which to live faithfully in any now is always suffused with a certain Sabbath like
Mm,
quality. In this
mm.
sense, I think the heart of Sabbath is learning that we're not in control.
Yeah.
And so the reason why you can quote unquote take a day off is precisely because you know the world doesn't depend on you.
Right.
And you can let it go. And I think that's really an intensification of what living faithfully in the now always looks like. It always has this tenor of an open-handedness,
Mm,
a kind of attention to what is given, where you realize I'm never going to master everything, I'm never going to accomplish everything, and I'm not in control. Thank God.
mm.
Therefore, all right, what am I released to attend to right now?
Yeah.
Um, does that make sense? I mean,
Yes,
how
it
does that
does.
play out in your
No, that
experience?
really, I really, I think that idea of being released to attend, especially knowing that our attention is so fragmented as humans, but also as particular humans in our moment, there's so much distraction, which, like,
Absolutely.
on the one hand, keeps us kind of on the surface of the present moment, but it also distracts us from the present moment, right?
Yes.
And from attending really to the work of love, which is what we're called to, I think, all the time. and and
Yes.
yet when our attention gets turned to the wrong things, then that love gets
the
distorted.
the um the tyranny of the urgent
Yeah.
is so different
Hmm.
than being present to the present.
Right.
And
Hmm.
I think you're right that we do need to just name and recognize that there are so many kind of cultural forces and cultural liturgies, I would say, that are really trying to mitigate against our capacity to be present to the present, and instead are just trying to sort of uh, honestly purchase our attention incessantly so that we're
Hmm.
never really fully present. We're just scattered, distracted. And I think, I mean, there's a weird sense in which, because you said it too, that well, we don't mean it's not like follow your bliss, do it's not
Yes, right.
unthinking, given over to hedonism or something like that. We have responsibilities that and covenants and promises we make that transcend the now. But
Hmm.
there's another sense in which I think my being faithful in the present is probably always a little microcosmic call within the season of a life. And so this is another theme that I talk about a
Yep.
bit in the book, which is I find it liberating and helpful to imagine that I don't just experience time as a chronological sequence of tick
Yeah.
tock or TikToks for that matter, but I experience it as it kind of congeals into chunks of a life that we might think of as seasons, and
Hmm.
and depending on the season in which you might find yourself, your sort of default attention in the present could be a little bit different, right? Like it could mean that you're just sort of primed to give yourself over to a kind of attention because you're in this season of your life as opposed to another season. So the college student versus the young parent versus the aged partner who's caring
Yep.
for a spouse with dementia. I mean, those are just such radically different seasons of a life, and the kind of way that I'll be faithful in the now will be different because of the season in which I find myself.
Well, and what you're talking about makes me think about a couple different things. And again, back to kind of the individual and the collective.
Yeah.
So on the individual level, I'm thinking about I was interested because you wrote about time as being either neither linear nor cyclical or both linear and cyclical, right? Like that we tend to think of it in these terms that might not actually work if we think about a timeline. But if we think about a cycle that always repeats back to the same place, that also is not even what we're
Right.
talking about, right? And I've been writing a lot about healing as a spiral where there's a sense
Great.
of you're coming back to the same place and yet you're actually, and I think by the grace of God, might be spiraling upward, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, we're having the same fight again. And yet it's actually different because I'm aware
Yeah.
of whatever it is
Yes.
that, even the awareness that it
Yes.
feels the same, right? And so I thought when I was reading, I was like, that sense of seasons, which again, I'm coming, even just the winter, fall, spring, summer, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a place of return, and yet there's also differences in the land and in the air and in the climate, all of these things. And I do think that as an individual, to recognize, as you said, to discern the season, to recognize the limitations inherent within that, to not see those as necessarily permanent. And that can be a hopeful posture. But then the other thing I'm thinking about, this is also early in the book, you write about knowing when we are and not just knowing where we are. And specifically, one of the examples you give is the Black Lives Matter debate. And why the historical moment really, when we are, comes to bear so much on whether or not we say Black Lives Matter. Could you just speak to that a little bit? Because that, again, I think is kind of that collective knowing
Yeah.
what season we're in really matters.
Right. And this is where I do think that there are different kinds of theologies, honestly, or spiritualities that really are just don't take history seriously. So
Yeah.
they think, time is flat because all we care about is eternity. And so therefore they're not really primed to read and appreciate the textures and specificity of
Hmm.
histories that we have lived through and that we are living in. And so when, in the face of, again, just systemic police brutality against black people in the United States, when people started saying as a protest that Black Lives Matter, you kind of heard, and I think sadly it came mostly from Christians, it seemed to
Yeah.
me, who said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wait! All lives matter, all lives matter." Which I didn't hear them saying that before people started saying Black
Right.
Lives Matter. So
Right.
that in itself is interesting. And so what I think is that's another example where, we retreat to this kind of generic pseudo eternity and don't realize that, in a sense, to say that all lives matter in this moment, in this place, at this time, given the history that we have lived through, is really false. I mean, you could
Hmm.
say it's kind of like theoretically and
Right.
universally true, but to say it now, given our history and given this moment, is really false witness, I would say. So we have to take our history seriously, and this is where I do think Americans, maybe broadly, but I also think Christians in a particular kind of way, we're not comfortable facing the specificity of the histories that have been handed down to us. And that, to me, that's an example of our blinders. That's
Right.
an example of our, like, we don't want to face, and we have illusions that we aren't heirs and inheritors of sort of accumulated ways of being that have been handed down to us,
Mm.
which I didn't choose to inherit, but I've benefited from. Do you know what I mean? I'm a white man who gets to move in the world in a particular way
Yeah.
because the world has been constructed in certain ways to benefit me.
Yep.
And in that sense, the world didn't have to be that way.
Right.
And by the way, the world is not going to be that way in the kingdom of God. So
Right.
I think facing the specificity and particularity of our history is a huge part of it. I mean, when you were talking earlier too about cyclical versus linear, I think your notion of the spiral is
Mm.
exactly right. In fact, there's a 19th century Danish philosopher, not that your listeners care about this, but Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard. He has a whole book called Repetition, which is
Mm.
exactly about that way in which
Mm.
we experience time as this sort of, it is a return, but it's always a return forward. And I think about that a lot in
Yeah.
connection with the liturgical calendar or the church calendar, where, every year we go through Advent and Christmastide and Epiphany and Lent and Easter, and you kind of keep living the life of Jesus over and over and over again. So it's cycle like, but on the other hand, we and I are different
Mm-hmm.
every single time we
Mm-hmm.
relive it. And so we are hearing and attuned and attentive and maybe broke open in new ways that now finally some aspect of God's grace and redemption sort of makes its way into us. And so we need the repetition to actually keep inhabiting the story.
Amen. Yeah, I am astonished, especially for me, the Advent season is a time of every year. I'm like, really? There is more to know. There's more to understand. There's more to receive. Are you kidding me? Because it's such a rich time of, again, returning to a pretty simple story and one I've known for a real long time. And yet, yeah, just being able to receive more
Always some other, the
always.
profundity of such simplicity.
Mm.
It means that you could literally spend an eternity dwelling in that mystery and confronting new aspects and seeing how it intersects with your own life and your own story and where you are now, when you are now.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's a gift.
I absolutely agree. Well, I have one final question that goes back a little bit to the kind of spiritual timekeeping, time management side of things. But I know you're someone who's written a lot, both in this book but elsewhere, about habits, about liturgies, about the ways in which how we move through the world shapes what we believe, who we become. And I'm curious about any practices that you have found that actually help you be someone who is a spiritual timekeeper and not just
Yeah,
a person, trying to urgently respond to the distraction of the moment.
right. I will say I do. We were just talking about the liturgical calendar. I think
Hmm.
letting the liturgical calendar sort of frame how you spend your days is, for me, is a real sort of kind of guardrail that channels you into a certain way of attention that also kind of pushes back on other default modes of timekeeping in our culture, consumer calendar, the academic calendar, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I do think that that's kind of a big macro
Hmm.
influence for me. On a micro level, yeah, it's a good question. I should have a better answer to it, except that I think it's probably just the rhythms of my marriage.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say there that we're kind of like still feel relatively new empty nesters, and so I think Deanna and I have, let me put it this way, I have rhythms that are not just dependent on my choices and my decisions.
Hmm.
They are sort of givens in our life that we take as the framework that we are living in. And so, the way we start a morning, the way we close a day, the way we sort of spend time together doing things that we could do more efficiently apart, but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless we commit to that time together. There's something about, I think we've signed up to waste time in a good way,
Mm-hmm.
because we've refused efficiency
Yeah.
as the overarching good. That's not a great answer to your question, but I think I should think about that more carefully.
Well, I think it's good to, I mean, again, I agree with you on the liturgical year and even your comments about like the quote unquote wasting time. I think about, again, back to our daughter Penny. I wrote a piece for Plow, I think a year ago, about an
Mm,
experience I had with her where we were in a national park and the rest of the family was just going to move more quickly. And so I said, "Go ahead, I'll stay back with Penn." And we were still hiking through a beautiful forest, but it was one of those things where the way I almost expected the narrative of that day to go was that because we walked slowly, we saw more beautiful things. And the others, ran ahead, kind of the, what is it, the rabbit and the tortoise or whatever,
yes,
like
yes,
in the race.
yes. Right.
And the bottom line was like the rest of the family saw the more spectacular views and we didn't. But I also realized that what I received that day was my daughter. Like I got
Mm,
her. I
mm,
got love.
mm,
I got presents. And
mm.
not that the rest of the family didn't. It wasn't an
Yeah,
either or, but
yeah,
there was this sense of my expectation is if I quote unquote waste time, I'm going to be given more of it some and it's like no. Like it is that in that being present to someone else
yes,
and not to everyone else. Again, there are limits on that, and you still got work to do, and that's fine. But
yes,
whether that's a weekly date night or, as you said, slowing down
yep,
in the morning or the evening to just listen and attend to one another, or I think the practice of Sabbath is another spiritual timekeeping practice, right? And then the liturgical year. I mean, I think that gives people plenty to go on.
yes.
So,
I'm so glad you highlight. That's a wonderful reminder too, that when we're talking about quote unquote wasting time, Marva Dawn wrote a book on worship called A
yeah.
Royal Waste of Time, which I
Mm.
think is really, really
Hmm.
brilliant. We're talking about wasting time relative to what a cult of efficiency tells you.
Yes.
And we're always talking about quote unquote wasting time with others. I
Yeah.
think it has to be,
Yeah.
and in that sense, I think the other thing that we have in our lives are sort of rhythms of friendship keeping that are
Hmm.
their own modes of spiritual timekeeping. Like we
Yeah.
have with our dearest friends, we have, I think now a 17-year tradition of Wednesday night wine, right? And
Wow.
that's just sort of like, that's just an
That's
appointment
amazing.
that we keep. And there are times when that has been a table in the wilderness. It's
Huh.
been, but it is. I think the more we imagine our timekeeping tethered to friendship tending,
Hmm.
the more we will sort of learn how to inhabit time faithfully.
I love that. That's a perfect place to end our conversation, too. So thank you so much for your time today and for your
Yes.
wisdom.
Thanks for your thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, as always, for listening to this episode of Love is Stronger Than Fear. And I would love to hear from you. At the end of this year, as we're looking ahead to 2023, what are some of the questions or thoughts that this conversation prompted for you? Are there other people you would love to hear on this podcast in the future? Let me know. My email is amyjuliabeckerwriter@gmail.com. I always want to give thanks also to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, and I also always want to end with a sense of blessing and prayer. A prayer and a hope that as you go into your day today, you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.